Apologies for not getting an episode out on schedule last week, pod fans. We lost one of our biggest fans and friends here at the Westminster Tradition pod last week. So this episode is dedicated to the memory of John Kirkham, a friend to workers, a warrior for transparency and government making sense, and a conscience of the South Australian Public Service. He will be deeply missed.
Do you think how we ended up here, and what about the times that I've said that we have had Horizon independently assured, or the times I've been present in meetings with parliamentarians, for example, and said we have had Horizon independently reviewed, investigated or assured? What about the Ernst & Young audits? Don't they count? What about the internal review that was reviewed by Deloitte? Doesn't that count? Have I said things in the past that don't really stack up?
To be honest, I can't remember exactly what I was thinking when I was considering this report, other than the fact that what the work that had been done so far by Second Sight was not the answer, was not what was required here, and that we needed to commission some more work. I can't go back and dig that out of my mind.
Welcome to the Westminster Tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robodebt Royal Commission. My name is Alison Lloyd-Wright. I'm a recovering public servant and a managing director of the Good Trouble Group. Joining me today on Kaurna land are two of my fellow recovering public servants, Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Alison.
And Danielle Elston of Good Government Advisory.
Hello, Alison.
So, last time we talked about the UK Post Office, we talked about the decade or so after the rollout of the dodgy Horizon IT system in 2001, and how and why the prosecution machine just kept on rolling inside Post Office, despite increasing evidence that something was deeply wrong. Today we're going to take another look at the Post Office IT scandal, this time through the lens of the role of independent inquiries and reviews. Take us away, Caroline.
Yeah, look, so one of the striking things about the Post Office scandal is how many internally sponsored inquiries there were from the top. You know, the chief executive, the board at various points commissioned an endless number of reviews. And so a couple of things striking about that, how few of them got close to the truth, and how even when they did get close to the truth, they didn't lead to things being better. So what I thought we might do today and in our next episode is just kind of go through each of the parts of, you know, when you of reviewing, and kind of take a case study from the Post Office, because it turns out there are many, and sort of say, this is how this one got it wrong. It's funny because I think my baseline assumption is that reviews are good things, but one of the things that we see over the kind of decade after about 2010 to 2020 is the way that reviews actually contributed to the prolongation, the making things longer and worse. And so I thought that might be something we might start with. So anyway, you guys up for a journey through maybe 5, maybe 6 different reviews?
Sure.
Bring it on. Excellent. All right. And in the grand tradition of Friends, which I'm sure is like deeply in the demographic of our listeners, I thought we could do each review as like the one where. And so in the first one.
I love it.
When we start talking, step 1 in any review is choosing whether to do an investigation. And so I thought we would call this one the one where you're too busy. And so we're going to start off by hearing a grab from Alice Perkins, who came in as the chair of Poll in 2011. And she starts to kind of hear stuff from MPs, and she goes away to the team and says, hey, I think we should do a review.
I think so. And as I said later in my witness statement, one of my regrets is that at this juncture, I didn't stop and think through more clearly with my colleagues on the board what exactly it was we were trying to do here and what would have been the best way of doing it. I think that do you mind me giving you a bit of context here? I think it's really, really important to understand here that when I came back from my first meeting with Lord Arbuthnot, when I had proposed that we should take a fresh look at this, I had a meeting with Mike Young and Susan Crichton, and they told me that they thought that this was not a good idea, that the system had been investigated numerous times, nothing had ever been found that was wrong, and that the organisation had basically too much on at the time to devote time to setting up such a review. And it was perfectly true, the organisation did have a huge amount on at that time. I didn't think that either of those reasons were good reasons for not looking at this afresh. And there then elapsed a period, and I can't remember how long it was, but it must have been several weeks, and absolutely nobody came back to me on this.
Period of silence, you describe it as in your witness statement.
Exactly. And I then obviously knew that I would need to follow up this discussion with Lord Arbuthnot, couldn't understand why I hadn't heard anything, raised it again, and was told that nothing had been done about it because it was thought to be a bad idea.
And you subsequently refer to this, I think, as pushback from the business.
Okay. All right. So let's have a talk about times we've initiated or not initiated reviews and what are the lessons we've learnt.
So one of the things I think is like critical in thinking about initiating reviews is there's the reviews you're forced to and there's the reviews you choose to. And I think like, they're different categories of reviews, right?
I think there's a third category, which is more along the lines of reviews where you are forced to or there's a complaint, but there's still a decision to not pursue or not. So there's like this third category altogether, which is you're forced to at least consider doing a review, but you are not really, it's your decision to whether to proceed or not.
Say a bit more about that. When do you think those ones come up?
Oh, they're the line ball ones. So to me, it's someone might complain. Lots of people have lotteries, for instance. So lots of charities have lotteries. Lots of like local pubs and clubs and sports groups, and there's a lot of rules to a lottery.
Sorry, could we just pause here? Because, Alison has an epically good story about an improperly administered raffle.
No.
Oh, it is not for fun, but when we're not recording, I will tell you about the improperly administered raffle that we realised was improperly administered and accordingly had to refund all the raffle ticket purchases.
How many checks for 50 cents?
Followers. Checks for $2, in fact, Caroline. I wrote a checkbook's worth of checks for various sums that were multiples
Oh my God.
of $2.
Right. Sorry, we're down a rabbit hole. Danielle, why are we talking about lotteries?
So lotteries have quite a few rules associated with them, but also the people who try and run a lottery are often your local sports club. They're not necessarily down the rabbit hole of the 300 rules.
Mm-hmm.
And you might see them on a lamp post or in a school newsletter and realise it was missing a piece of information. But there's also a decision point there, which is everyone doing this in good faith? What are some of the risks? Or even if there's a complaint, it could be that there was, a missing word in the mandatory part that has to be printed on the back of the ticket. There are some investigations, because that's a compliance issue, you can go down, the whole rabbit hole, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are, I think that third category is where it is humanly possible, it's available to you to go straight down an investigative pathway, and you have to consider the risks and benefits of doing so. So there's the ones you're forced to do, there's the ones that you trip over, you lift a rock and you're like, oh God, now I have to go and look at this properly. And then there's the ones that are in your orbit, you're made aware of, and you have to decide whether the resources are worth it, whether the outcome is worth it in pursuing them.
And what even powers you have to do a review. So two of the ones I've been involved with, two where a minister became aware of something via the media and wished to conduct a review, but what they wished to conduct a review of was an organisation and body with no relationship to government.
That is really, really tricky. I had one of those once, and I've thought carefully about how much of this I can share, but actually it's all pretty Googleable, where we administered the funding for a school chaplaincy program, and there was a media report by someone who had worked in one of the funded providers who said that the provider had someone in it who had said that children with behaviour difficulties were possessed by the devil. And so and it was 3 weeks after an election. We had a new government. It was my area where the money was. And it was one of those things where it's like, actually, what is so we're not the provider of the service. We're a grant. We're actually a post box for money from the Commonwealth to the provider. And so thinking through what does initiating a review look like that? I certainly had no powers of compulsion for information if that was where we were going. That's a really challenging situation. I was trying to think about it before we talked about it. It's on the public record that we instigated a review, and we did that with the cooperation and consent of the provider, which if they hadn't provided their cooperation and consent, I'm not sure I could have completed that review. I'm not sure any findings would have been meaningful if we had only been able to talk to the person who spoke to the media and not to the other people. So it is really tricky when you're making those choices, like actually what are my powers, what am I, and also when it's something really fraught, like God in schools, that's hard.
And so I guess the important lesson for me there was making sure that the minister understood what the limits on any review would be and what the limits on actioning the findings of any review would be if the organisation wasn't in receipt of government funding and otherwise had no particular relationship to the government. Was there a role for government to do a review at all?
So the first thing you do have to do is check your powers, right? So the first thing you have to do is check your remit here. And, I mean, there's plenty of things that people find distressing and talk to you in government about trying to solve that we don't have those powers over, Alison.
Exactly.
And that we can't do anything about necessarily. And so I really do think that there's a certain amount of the first step is like, what is my capacity here to investigate? Before you even get to do I have the resources? What's the risk? It's like, can I?
But sometimes the political pressure is so much that you must.
Indeed.
Right?
Yeah.
And you must just find a way to...
Mm-hmm. You must, because there's a genuine public interest in understanding what this issue is, and that if there is no investigation or review, then often, it leads to worse outcomes for everyone involved.
I also think there's quite a big difference between a review and an investigation.
Oh, yes. We're mostly talking about reviews here, though, like reviews into the post office, right?
So I do think that there's the look. To me, a review is we pay for something, we're a part of something, and we want to check that it's working properly and that everything's being done properly. To me, there's an investigation is a bit more of a whodunit.
Yep.
Usually is much more legal. And procedural, whereas we do run those kind of reviews. I mean, you run policy reviews, you run reviews into lots of things and programs. And so some of it in the case of what you're talking about, and can we just put a pin, Caroline, in the federalism of this country that enables the Commonwealth to just throw money out there but not be worried about kind of the application of how it works, and that kind of work is always left to the states to mop up who got the money and whether they did what they were supposed to with it. But leaving that aside,
in fairness, I think the Commonwealth Department were advised of this review, but anyway.
But I just so I think that's to me the difference is there's lots of things that you review, then there are things I think you look into. Investigation to me is that last year. If you are investigating, you've opened a door that has to be taken all the way to its kind of completion.
Well, I think you will discover that in post office they investigated a number of times and they did not take it all the way to completion. But I do think you're right, Dee. There's like a different flavour. But one of the really interesting things about these questions is that you might think you're entering into a kind of, are we generally kind of reviewing that we're happy enough with this kind of arrangement that we have with this entity or whatever. And then as you get into it, you're like, holy dooly, there is deep individual misconduct going on in that organisation. And then you kind of shade into this investigation kind of place, which is much more which requires a different skill set, which thinks a lot more about about kind of, procedural fairness if you're going to be making findings about people. Like, you can find yourself in a very different place.
Very quickly. One minute you're talking to people about something that you perceive to be a problem or you think might be concerning, and the next minute you are in an actual investigation where everyone needs their procedural fairness and you're going to start exercising powers, and it can switch in a moment.
One of the places where I think that happens, and one of the places where you do want to think carefully before you initiate a review, not because you shouldn't do it, but because you should exactly think about what is the skill set and what's the thing, are those kind of culture reviews, like, where you kind of, and this has definitely happened to me, I used to run a very big part of it with lots of distributed offices, and you might hear that there's an office with a particular cultural problem.
Yep.
That's right. And so you might send in someone to do a kind of, a strategic cultural review, and everyone gets together to talk about how we might like the culture to improve. And one of the sticky notes is like significant bullying and harassment problem. That is quite a common scenario, right? Like, and if you haven't thought about it on the way in, you can find yourself halfway through an investigation or review, and sometimes the instinct is to kind of not take that forward. And I definitely know there are people who don't take it forward. I've never not, but I wouldn't want to be saintly about it.
It's one of my challenges with just generally with culture reviews, which is that the people who often do them are not very industrially trained or misconduct trained or corruption trained or all of the other kind of more crunchy areas of misconduct. And so you send someone in who might be finding rich information, but without being able to pinpoint or understand their obligations necessarily around, this isn't culture now, this is this is potential maladministration or potential misconduct, and I think that goes back to something we do all the time, which is that sticky note part of culture, and then the crunchy part, which is if we break rules, like, we have codes of conduct, we can be sacked, and they run separately, but they're not separate things.
No. They're really not. So the example that that I've chosen for this one is not one of those culture reviews. It's, it's Alice Perkins as the chair saying, I'm hearing that there are things going on, and the business saying, look, we've already looked at this 7 times and we're incredibly busy. We've just demerged from Royal Mail Group. No one has the capacity to support one of these kinds of inquiries. Exactly. Well, and I'm sure we've all worked in agencies where you've had an inquiry foisted on you by, I don't know, there was I've seen it happen where a piece of legislation has passed and there was a commitment to the opposition or to people on the crossbench that there would be an inquiry into a certain matter, right? So you get these inquiries foisted on you at a very busy moment, and they're not your highest priority. That is a challenge, right? Like, how do you make sure that you're honouring that and giving the right level of bandwidth to that when the whole business is like, oh my God, why are you doing this stupid thing over there?
And then do you have the money to put it out to market, because that's really expensive, but then are you in the position to mark your own homework? Exactly. Is it your own homework that you're marking?
We will get to who is doing the review later, Danielle. Look at you jumping ahead in the show notes.
All right. So should we jump ahead though then to the next phase in conducting a review?
Yeah. So you've got someone has decided to conduct a review. Someone has agreed and sort of thought through all the questions of how do you do it. Then you've got to choose your terms of reference. And I like to call this one the one where you ask the wrong question. And we've actually talked about this report before. So in 2010, there's a new managing director in Pole, a guy called Dave Dave Smith, I think. Like, he may have had the most generic name. In fact, I think there were two. Anyway, Dave Smith says to his team, God, there's a lot of bitching and moaning about Horizon, and you guys keep telling me it's okay. Can we do a review? And here we're going to hear from Mr. Roderick Ismay, who is the person who conducts this internal review, about what his terms of reference were for the review.
Were the terms of reference for the writing of the report?
I don't think there was a written terms of reference for it, but the terms of it were to understand the reasons why Post Office should be able to take assurance about the Horizon system. What are all those reasons of positives? So this was obviously an ongoing situation where some allegations were being made about Horizon. Dave, I think, was relatively new to Post Office. I think he was only managing director for about a year. I think he came from somewhere in Royal Mail and went back to somewhere in Royal Mail. In the period that he was there, I think that given the comments that he was hearing, allegations, this was a question to me to say, well, you know, what's the counter arguments to this?
So you can hear from Mr. Ismay why maybe they didn't get to the bottom of what was going on to Horizon when he thought his terms of reference was to write down all the reasons why Horizon was reliable without looking at the other side of the ledger. That's a pretty terrible terms of reference, right?
We've all seen some terrible terms of reference in our time.
Kind of depends on what answer you want.
Well, indeed. I always think it's a bit cynical the way people say, you know, you shouldn't commission a review without knowing the answer. I really don't hold with that.
Yeah, it kind of assumes that we ought be absent curiosity, which offends me at a molecular level.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Like, I do think you should think really carefully, and royal commissions are the worst for this. You should think really carefully about how big a question are we asking, and is it actually reasonable to ask, 10 people in the space of a year to answer a question like, how do we solve mental health in Victoria was one, for example.
Yeah.
Like, I think there is definitely, you should think about the scope of your question and whether it's reasonable.
Absolutely.
The politics of that is also, though, if you narrowed that to just riffing with your how do you fix mental health, if you made that for people in the outer suburbs under the age of 30, you don't get the political win by launching your Royal Commission because everyone says, oh, it's not even a Royal Commission into me or what I need or whatever else. And I honestly think, given all the time and money we spend on Royal Commissions, we spend having, I think all three of us done this a few times, perhaps not enough time on the terms of reference. Once we decide to pull the trigger on doing them, the drafting of them can often be very fast. And that is quite problematic because, of course, they are the scope.
But also there is that... Sorry, you go, Caroline.
Oh, I was just going to say, often the drafting is kind of done by the press release. Like, it's kind of done by... Because often royal commissions like this are come to via pressure, right? And so often the drafting of the terms of reference could look like seeing what the relevant minister or first minister said in the presser when they finally conceded we're going to have a banking royal commission, for example. You just kind of... Yeah. They're not always conceived of with the thought of how implementable they are.
Well, but also I think there is an art in, to go back to kind of the theme of this discussion, drawing the distinction between reviewing a thing that happened, what went wrong, is it going wrong, could we stop it from going wrong in the future, to the sort of the mental health of Victoria one, design the most perfect version of this ever is not the same question. And you've got to think about where the authorising environment wants you to be on, is it just a question of did some people make a mistake and is it fixable, versus what decision ought they have taken if they were the cleverest, most competent and capable people in the world.
It's interesting because I've always been of the view that policy royal commissions in general are bad. And then I ran a policy royal commission. And I think, I like to think we did an all right job on that one. But partly I think it was because it wasn't actually a policy royal commission. Like, it sounds like it was Royal Commission into Early Childhood Education and Care. But actually it was asked a very specific question. Yeah. How do you implement 3-year-old preschool in South Australia? Like, that is more a programmatic than a policy question, right? So it hit that nice balance of forward-looking, but also deliverable, and also like quite a constrained. It wasn't like, what should we do for every child in South Australia and everything? Yeah. So
I think I don't know, the reason Royal Commissions can be challenging from a policy environment is because they're structured in a very legalistic way, a very interrogatory. Is that a word?
What's the word? Adversarial.
Adversarial, thank you.
Prosecutorial.
Yeah, it's all the lawyers.
They're a little bit like the French kind of criminal system, that inquisitorial system of running down rabbit holes, and the terms of reference have to be referred to when you're talking to your people, and they're often staffed with lawyers, and no one else speaks like that or knows what's going on. Or I think they are really, really challenging.
So what are our other bits of advice for anyone who is drafting terms of reference?
So one thing I would say from my kind of incidental interfaces with intergovernmental relations along the way is some jurisdictions, and yes, I'm talking about you, Victoria, are really good at picking up the pen and writing the first draft of the terms of reference for any kind of shared inquiry or whatever. And I always think it's like such a cheap and easy policy win, and I was always cross we didn't do as much of it as we should have in South Australia, because it is true that holding the pen and like the first draft of a terms of reference is incredibly powerful in shaping what is going to be conceived of as the problem that's being solved. So I really highly recommend people don't be like, oh, well, I'm far too busy to engage in this. Like, get in there and think, actually, what do I want to get from this?
Yep.
I have a question for you both that I don't know the answer to. I know, like, no setup.
What? We're not supposed to do that.
Not sure we're going to know the answer to it either, Dee, but let's go.
What's the appropriateness of engaging your reviewer in the terms of reference? So I'm going really broadly here, so not just royal commissions, because the Acts may have different views on that, and so I don't want to parse it. But one of the best policy inquiries I was a part of, a judge did an inquiry for us, and it was perfectly legitimate to double check that it was this bit of the Act and not that bit of the Act before we finalised them. And they were much better terms of reference because the person who had to do the work had helped us not frame the answer. This wasn't like preloading the answer. It was, you guys have headed in one direction in the terms of reference, which is going to cut me off from looking at something over here.
Absolutely.
And that worked a lot better.
Is it controversial? I think it's so obviously a good idea. I'm trying to work out who argues against it.
Oh, I don't think it happens every time. I think those terms of reference are often done on a Sunday, sent to Cabinet on a Monday and given to an inquiry person or a Royal Commissioner on a Tuesday.
I mean, I would like to say not when Alison was the head of Cabinet Office, because she would never allow such a late.
Very
But yes, no, I hear your point. But that's not a matter of principle, though. Like, are there people who think it is unprincipled?
Well, you have to be careful, all right, because you're giving them the scope and the terms, obviously.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to have it shaped by the person investigating it. But also, anyway, it's just a question. What do you think, Alison?
I'm with Caroline. I think there's a tremendous amount of value in having the eminent personages who you've asked to conduct the review have a say in drafting those terms of reference. But again, it goes back to that kind of legalistic tradition. Judges don't have a say in the scope of the case that's put before them. The case that is put before them is put before them. And so, I can see sort of how we arrive at two different philosophies about it, I suppose, but I've always found there to be a huge amount of value in involving the reviewer.
So, in addition to the guy who was asked to write down the reasons why things are good, I also thought we could have talked about in this one. There was a mediation scheme that came out as a result of a review and investigation process led by Second Sight, and we'll talk about their choice in a little bit. But halfway through the mediation scheme, the kind of Sir Anthony Hooper, who was the former, I don't know, Grand Poobah of some amazing court or something in the UK. They always have great names like the Garter or the whatever. Anyway, so Anthony Hooper of the Black Garter, he says that while he was conducting this mediation scheme, he really realised that the problem was that they were literally doing the wrong review. They were doing case-by-case looking,
rather than seeing the system problem.
The whole picture. And literally he says, because of the age of the cases, because of the many complications, you weren't going to find the smoking gun in these cases. And yet that was how they had structured the process. And not, I think, deliberately to avoid discovering the smoking gun. It was because they hadn't done that thinking about what are we trying to do? And they were doing that emotional thinking of, we're trying to shut up people, right? Like we're trying to give...
And if something went wrong here, it went wrong to certain individuals, and we'll find a way to see what went wrong for them and remediate that without ever zooming out.
Yeah. I think that's interesting.
But isn't that similar to, and I can't remember the acronym, Caroline, but each individual Robodebt case at the ART, some lawyer, external lawyers getting paid X amount, and they send it to the mysterious inbox saying, and through all of that, nobody thought that they would pile up those emails and run them through ChatGPT and go, oh, God, there's a really big pattern here. Oh, my God, there's a pattern. Pattern recognition, reception maths, So it's a very similar thing of looking at everything individually and not having any either interest, capacity or anything else to pull it all together.
Well, and the reason I was thinking about it in that context is you were talking about like the ability of the reviewer to comment on the terms of reference. Like, here's a radical thought. What if halfway through the review,
you realise you're reviewing the wrong thing?
These terms of reference are not going to answer the question that you're interested in. There's a radical idea. I can see that would actually break public service brains a lot.
I think there have been times where, certainly for royal commissions, the commissioner can seek to add supplementary things to the inquiry from memory. But
yeah, I mean, look, the things I can remember, I mean, there's always the, sorry, we need more time.
Sorry, can we just pause here? Except for
yours. Except for yours. Mine weren't quite as lucky.
Didn't have Julia Gillard.
So there's the more time. We know that Commissioner Holmes changed her date so that the NAC, and we've got more coming, guys, don't worry, but so that the NAC Act was up and running before she finalised her report. I can't think of a time off the top of my head, Alison, but I would say that I can't think of anything off the top of my head that stops a commissioner going back to government with advice that the TOR needs to change or something else needs to change. They change lots of other things that I can think of.
Yeah. But I don't think they can change the existing ones, but they can add to them. So, yeah, that's my belief anyway.
I mean, they're pretty big powers, aren't they?
Yeah.
But they're pretty wide-ranging powers. They're like pretty outrageously wide.
They are.
And I hate to be predictable and repetitive, but all of this is really coming back to like that basic policy work of, what's the Einstein saying? I'd spend 90% identifying the problem. Like actually, it's just the basic policy work of understanding what problem are you trying to solve, not what's causing you pain, not what's making you uncomfortable. Actually, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And I don't know, it seems unfair, I think, especially in the case where you're doing a reactive commissioning of a review, to think that you have done all that thinking up front. So I do think there is something maybe about providing us with a kind of mental space of saying, actually, it might be okay if halfway through you're like, we need to go in this direction.
Yeah, because it can be very hard to persuade an authorising environment that you should do 90% of that thinking up front.
Almost impossible, I would say. Almost impossible.
Deeply challenging. Yeah. All right. Well, this has been a great teaser for the start of inquiries. Can you even do one? Should you do one? What's it into? Next episode, we'll talk about the conduct of inquiries and how they end. Next time.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.